As you all know, Oscar Wilde is quite famous for a lot of quotes. One of them goes as follows: if you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh, otherwise they might kill you. As you might have guessed, we're going to talk about humor, and more specifically about its function and its overall significance in effective communication. Let me start first with a story, an anecdote. Once upon a time, there was a king's court, and there was a beloved and very successful jester. He would amuse the king and all the people by the king, but one day, he actually crossed the line a bit, and he insulted his king. The king was completely infuriated, so he ordered that the jester be executed. Now, what happened was that the court, which loved the jester, pleaded by the king to at least let the jester decide on the way that he should die. The king actually granted that request and asked the jester. And the jester, true to his form, he said, "My lord, if it's all the same to you, I shall prefer to die of old age." So, in that sort of whimsical and humorous response, the jester was able to save his own life. On a more realistic and serious note from real life, that gentleman behind me is Norman Cousins. He was a professor of medicine at UC Berkeley. In 1964, I think, in the 1960s, he did a trip to Russia. He came back and he had contracted serious heart disease. What he chose for his treatment, along a lot of scientific and medical options, was to include laughter and comedy as part of his therapeutic methods. So he'd watch funny films, he'd listen to funny clips, he'd actually try to laugh more. And he realized that laughter and humor really had an anesthetic effect similar to that of painkillers. But now let's move from the realm of anecdotes and stories to the actual science behind humor and its use in our lives and in effective communication. Angela is going to give us a deep dive into the real science.
So what is humor? And more importantly, how can it help us when we think about communicating? 100 years ago, Charles Darwin compared humor to tickling of the brain. And actually, it turned out that he wasn't that far off. I'm going to give you the 1-minute sort of humorless overview of what humor does to our brains and bodies and why it's so important to include as a communication tool. So studies have found that humor impacts us in 3 ways. First, it's good for our minds. Second, it's good for our bodies. And third, it improves our social relationships. In terms of our brains, you can see behind me the composite results of hundreds of studies that were done on different types of patients, on different types of jokes. The big level takeaway is that humor engages your entire brain. And this is why it's so good for engaging your attention and improving your memory. The other thing that we can notice about the brain and humor is that it's a 2-step process. First, cognitive processes kick in. And second, an emotional process kicks in that allows us to actually enjoy a joke. In other words, it's something that encompasses our whole being when we find something funny. Second, humor is good for our bodies. Medical studies have shown that when we laugh, our muscles relax, our blood pressure drops, and actually our immunity is even boosted. So the science actually shows that humor is good as a medicine for disease. And finally, third, as we've all experienced, humor is good for our social relationships. It allows us to diffuse tension in a situation or address a difficult topic in a way that kind of allows us to laugh together. So with these 3 reasons in mind why humor can be such a powerful communication tool, Mahmoud is going to walk us through some practical examples of this in practice and how it can really work.
We looked at 3 areas where humor could be used in a good way to improve our presentation skills, basically. The first one is introducing levity. And here, typically, we are dealing with complex situation, and we want to make sure we send the message very simply and in such a nice way to the audience. The second area where we looked at is making the message very powerful. There is a statement that we use, there is a phrase that we use in the business school when we are describing the product market fit, which basically goes like, you want the food to eat their own dog food. And basically that phrase has been said in 1970, and we still remember it because of the humor aspect of it. And the third area where humor could be used very effectively in presentation, is to break the ice and engage very nicely with your audience. We learned throughout the class that having a conversation with the audience is such a nice way to reduce the anxiety. And now let's look at one example where we thought humor was used very nicely in levity. In the White House Correspondence, basically it's a dinner where the President of the United States, and in this case Barack Obama, get in an event with the national press in DC, and basically they take a moment to relax, get out of the weed, and laugh. And if you look at their kind of interaction in the past year, they're basically going toes to toes together. And if you look at basically at the dinner, you would feel three things that impact you. First of all, the first impact that it had on ourselves is the person comes like a very natural and authentic, and basically bring the human aspect of them and make us connect with them very well. The second thing that we felt as an impact on ourselves when we looked at the White House Correspondent, it's basically helped the whole thing to reset and start in a new conversation. And the third one is basically replenish the energy and engage in more serious conversation in the future. So let's have a look.
I usually start these dinners with a few self-deprecating jokes. After my stellar 2013, what could I possibly talk about? I admit it. Last year was rough. Sheesh. At one point, things got so bad, the 47% called Mitt Romney to apologize. Of course, we rolled out healthcare.gov. That could have gone better.
The second thing we want to talk about is using humor to amplify the power of your message. So in this class, we've seen clips from The Daily Show. And one of the things we noticed is that Jon Stewart is incredibly effective at bringing humor to the specific political issues that he wanted to focus on and he wanted to highlight. And we thought that this is an incredibly, incredibly effective way to make his message even more poignant. But we wanted to bring it something that we could relate to. That's a national scale on a daily basis. We wanted to think about the GSB. Every year, the GSB puts on the GSB show. It allows the writers of the show to perhaps make their own statements about the environment that they go to school in. In this clip, they've taken a panel, and the panel is basically serving as the staff that looks over kind of everything that we have to do to schedule, which has its fair share of red tape. This is how they decided to present it.
Good morning. Welcome to the Center and Initiatives for Research Curriculum Learning Experiences Joint Education Representation Knowledge, or as we like to call it, the Circle Jerk.
There's a message there that perhaps more bluntly couldn't be communicated, but using humor as its vehicle, I think that they get their point across. Now, we have to say at this point, we're very aware of our pandering. We're going to go from JD's favorite person, Jon Stewart, to JD's actual favorite person, Ken Daigle. We think humor is an incredibly effective way at creating comfort with your audience, both for the speaker and for the audience. Everyone in this class went through the exercise with Ken. And all that was meant to do was bring down our anxiety so that when we were randomly called to the stage, we were able to effectively communicate with our audience. We wanted to focus on the humor of that. In that span, in that class, we laughed. We laughed a lot. We were uncomfortable. But what we saw by the end of that was incredibly effective communication across a couple different functions. We saw great posture. We saw a lot of confidence in the way that you stood and delivered. We saw much fewer filler words, which to us suggests a great comfort with who you're presenting to. We saw creative topics. I think we all remember Abby's love for the green juice blender. And we just saw a compelling presence. One of the things that we love about humor is that we think it gives you a presence to your audience. Now we'll ask Manolis to come wrap it up.
So it is quite clear that humor can be a very powerful agent and a very powerful tool in your verbal and non-verbal communication. What we'd like you to remember is that humor is tied to the very holy grail of effective communication, the well-known AIM structure. So in terms of the audience, what humor does is to actually create a level of comfort and trust. It also makes the presenter more likable and more relatable. This is exactly what we saw at the exercise with Ken Duggal. Secondly, humor can be a very powerful agent in transmitting and bearing the presenter's intent. That's what we saw in the anecdotal story about the jester who managed through humor and through that whimsical wit to save his own life. And what is a higher intent than actually saving the presenter's life? And thirdly, humor can be a very powerful tool in amplifying and bearing the message and making comments which would otherwise be quite caustic and almost bland. And this is what we all, our classmates, did during the GSB show regarding the efficacy of the administration. There's some very good news for all of you. You can start right away to find ways to employ humor in your presentations. There are multiple resources which are free and easily accessible. Quite easily, you have a lot of content on YouTube. You can see great speakers who have actually based their very presentation skills on humor itself. You can also find a lot of articles which are going to teach you how to use humor effectively in verbal communication. A lot of books which take a more scientific approach to the subject. And a lot of webinars and videos on humor itself and on even more specific subjects around employing humor in communication. Thanks very much for your attention.